November sunlight bathed the streets of Dallas, but what followed was a shattering of time itself. The sound of shots pierced the air, and Jacqueline Kennedy, wrapped in a pink suit, bent over her wounded husband as the motorcade sped forward. The moment, brief as lightning, would stretch into eternity, fixing her image forever in the consciousness of nations. Welcome, dear listener, wherever you may be. Perhaps you hear these words late in the night, or in the quiet of early dawn, and I invite you to share below when and where you listen, so that this story becomes a thread in a wider tapestry of memory. And if you feel moved, touch the subscribe button so that this channel of timeless history may continue weaving voices of the past into the present. The echo of the gunshot still lingers in the imagination of generations, and it is there that we must begin, though the story of Jacqueline Kennedy stretches far before and long after that fateful day. Yet memory is stubborn, and it refuses to unfasten her from the moment when history turned its gaze upon her. She sat beside her husband in the open car, the November air crisp against her face, the crowd waving with untroubled joy, and then sound shattered the illusion. Sharp, metallic, unforgiving. The pink suit that had been chosen with care that morning, elegant and composed, became stained with the violent testimony of death. She did not cry out. She did not collapse. She leaned toward him, as though her body alone could shield him from what had already happened. Silence was her answer to chaos. Her stillness so complete was more haunting than any cry. Some would call it strength. Others would wonder if it was disbelief, a refusal of the body to acknowledge what the mind could not yet accept. The world saw those images, broadcast and printed, endlessly repeated. Jackie became the widow in real time, a figure both personal and universal, carrying not only her own grief, but also the grief of a people. In her composure, there was something that transcended ordinary sorrow, as though she were already aware that she was standing at the edge of myth. She did not change her suit that day, even when urged. She kept it on, its stains a silent declaration. Let them see what they have done. Her body became a vessel of testimony, her presence an unwilling relic of the crime. And perhaps she knew, even then, that there was no escaping the weight of that image. What does it mean when one moment defines a life? Do we become prisoners of that instant, unable to escape its shadow? Or does it grant us a strange form of immortality? Jackie Kennedy would live for 3 more decades after Dallas, yet for many she remained forever frozen there, the woman beside the fallen president, dignified yet marked by tragedy. The poets might say that history conspired to give her the face of sorrow itself, so that a nation could look upon her and find both consolation and unbearable loss. In that moment she became more than a wife, more than a mother, more than a first lady. She became a mirror, reflecting the fragility of all things. The grandeur of Camelot, as the Kennedy years were later called, collapsed in an instant, and all that was left was the quiet figure of Jackie in her blood-stained attire. People watched her and thought of their own families, their own loves, their own vulnerability to the merciless turn of fate. And yet she did not speak. She let silence carry her, and in that silence people placed their own interpretations. Was she numb? Was she strong? Was she already retreating into some hidden place where no camera could follow? On Air Force One, when Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president, she stood beside him, her suit unchanged, her eyes emptied yet resolute. Some witnesses said she seemed far away, others that she was entirely present. Perhaps both were true. She had been propelled into a realm where personal emotion and public spectacle intertwined, and she bore it with the quietness of someone who knew there was no other choice. That flight back to Washington was not only the journey of a widow, but also the strange passage of a woman into the unending corridors of history. And yet, As we linger with that scene, we must not forget that she was still a young woman, barely 34 years old, holding her children's future in her arms, even as her husband's body lay still. Her beauty, her elegance, her composure, all of it was now layered with grief that would never fully leave her. What does it mean to be so young and yet to carry so ancient a sorrow, to see the life you imagined torn apart in the span of a heartbeat? One wonders if, in that silence, she began to hear the faint echo of a destiny she had not chosen. The day's images ended, but the silence lingered long after. The sound of the motorcade faded, the crowds dispersed, yet that silence carried her into the funeral days, into the endless photographs, into the imagination of strangers. Her stillness became her armor, her poise her only refuge, and perhaps that is why we must begin here, not because it is the whole of her life, but because it is the key that unlocks the mystery of who she became. Jackie Kennedy was not simply a woman of fashion or of charm. She was a woman who learned, through unbearable circumstance, how to shape silence into a shield and tragedy into memory. Even now, as we recall her, the echo of that gunshot drifts across time. It fades into the background like the distant toll of a bell, and we are left staring at her quiet figure in pink, asking ourselves what it means to endure such a moment before the eyes of the world. The image does not resolve. It remains suspended, haunting, unresolved, and so we let it linger as we prepare to step backwards into her earlier days, before the shadows of Dallas, when her life was filled with the light of youth and the cadence of childhood summers. The cadence of childhood summers begins softly, as if carried by the echo of hooves striking against sun-warmed ground, a rhythm that belonged to the young Jacqueline Bouvier, before the world knew her as Kennedy, before she wore the garments of tragedy. The horse's steady steps beat against the air of East Hampton, where the salt breeze mingled with the green of trees, where her laughter, often subdued and watchful, was shaped into something both playful and reserved. She was born into privilege, but privilege alone does not shape a soul. There was her father, John Vernou Bouvier, known as Black Jack, a man of charm and weakness, with a smile that dazzled and a life that often slipped into excess. He adored his daughter, and from him she inherited a kind of allure, the sparkle in the eye that suggested secrets kept behind the veil of manners. Yet with that charm came instability, the tremor of gambling debts, the scent of drink, the restlessness of a man who loved too many things too recklessly. Her mother, Janet Leigh, was of a different order, precise, demanding, determined to shape her children into models of grace. Where Black Jack offered laughter and indulgence, Janet offered structure, criticism, and expectation. She would later remarry, and Jackie would learn early that families, like garments, could be remade, though the seams might never quite disappear. To live between the warmth of a father's adoration and the cold gaze of a mother's judgment was to learn both the sweetness and sharpness of love. Perhaps it was there, in those divided currents, that Jackie first mastered the art of composure, of holding her true feelings behind a surface of elegance. From childhood, Jackie was admired not only for beauty, but for an intelligence that peers and teachers found striking. She devoured books, scribbled observations in notebooks, wrote poetry that lingered in the shadows of longing. Yet she was not an obedient girl, not easily molded into the perfect image her mother wished. She was restless, daring, quick to laugh at the absurd, inclined to question. In her youth, there was something mischievous, a spirit that would gallop as freely as the horses she loved. Some remembered her as shy, others as bold. Perhaps she was both, and perhaps that duality never left her. The world of wealth and society in which she was raised offered comfort, yet it also carried the weight of appearances. To be a Bouvier daughter was to learn that charm could open doors, but that reputation could close them just as quickly. Jackie observed, learned, absorbed. She knew how to make her presence felt, not by loudness, but by an elegance that seemed instinctive. Even as a child, she was compared to a French portrait, delicate yet resolute, as though centuries of refinement had already touched her. And yet behind those observations, who can say what she felt? Did she long for a world freer than the carefully measured one around her? Did she suspect, even then, that beauty and elegance were both gifts and burdens? The summers were filled with the sound of tennis balls struck across courts, with the shimmer of sunlight on waves, with parties where the young paraded before the eyes of elders. Jackie moved among them, observant, never entirely surrendering to frivolity. She sketched, she wrote, she listened. Horses were her truest companions, the creatures with whom she seemed most at ease. The rhythm of their hooves gave her both freedom and control, the sense that she could outrun the constraints of expectation, if only for a while. In photographs of those years, she gazes into the distance with a seriousness that startles, as if already carrying some awareness of fate. And then there was Paris, not yet lived, but dreamed, for Jackie was captivated by the idea of Europe, by the refinement of France, by the cadence of languages that hinted at other ways of being. At school, she excelled, winning awards for literature, for writing that showed depth beyond her years. Teachers admired her, though some noted a quiet aloofness, as though she belonged partly to another world. That distance would remain with her throughout life, a kind of protective glass between her and others, a reserve that made her seem enigmatic. Family life was not without turbulence. The separation of her parents left scars, though Jackie seldom displayed them openly. She became practiced in the art of concealment, learning that one could endure pain silently, transforming it into a polished exterior. Perhaps this was her first rehearsal for what the world would one day demand of her. The girl who held her chin high when her family fractured would one day hold it high before nations, though the pain then would be immeasurably greater. In reflecting upon those early years, one cannot help but wonder, was she shaped more by love or by loss, more by privilege or by fracture? She lived in houses with wide lawns and gleaming windows, yet also in the shadows of broken promises and shifting loyalties. Such contrasts may explain why she became both worldly and wary, both enchanting and elusive. For a child to be praised as extraordinary is a gift, yet it also isolates. Who could truly know her? Who could reach beneath the elegance, the talent, the precocity, to the beating heart of a girl who longed for both freedom and belonging? The hooves of her horse marked time in those summers, striking against the ground like a clock without numbers, only rhythm. They carried her across meadows, into forests, toward horizons that seemed limitless. Yet all horizons bend back into the realities of family, of society, of expectation. Jackie learned to move between those realms, between freedom and formality, between the laughter of galloping wind and the strictures of a dinner table, where posture and silence were required. This duality became her signature, and perhaps her survival. As evening fell on those childhood days, the scent of the sea would rise, mingling with the smoke of lamps with the rustle of leaves. Jackie would retreat to her books, her sketches, her writing. She recorded impressions not only of places but of people, with a sharpness that hinted at both wit and critique. Even then, she was shaping herself into a keen observer, one who could move within the currents of society, yet never be entirely consumed by them. And as we linger in this image, the sound of hooves continues, steady, unresolved, carrying us toward her youth at Vassar, toward the wide doors of Paris, where the fragrance of gardens awaited her, where the world would open yet again, inviting her into another rhythm of becoming. The sound of hooves, rhythmic and insistent, softens as it carries us forward into the steps she took upon the lawns of Vassar, where the cadence of her life grew more deliberate, more intricate, more entwined with books and thought, and the fragrance of distant gardens, yet unseen. It is here, among the halls of education, that Jacqueline Bouvier began to shape the mind that would one day charm the world with its poise, not only in elegance, but in depth, in the way she wove language, history, and art into the fabric of her being. She had long been recognized for her intelligence, though many chose to remark first upon her beauty. At Vassar, she began to press against those limitations, striving to prove that she was more than a poised young woman of society. Her professors noted her seriousness, her sharpness, her refusal to be content with the surface of things. She probed texts, asked questions, lingered with ideas as though they were companions on a long and winding walk. Yet even in that environment, she carried her reserve. Jackie was not one to lose herself in frivolous chatter, though she could charm when she wished. She held herself apart, a figure observed yet seldom fully known. Her classmates admired her sense of style, her composure, her wit that surfaced unexpectedly like the glint of sun on still water. And beneath that reserve was the restlessness of a mind, hungry for more than the prescribed life of polite society. She longed for distance, for the Europe she had dreamed of, for the scent of Parisian gardens and the cadence of French spoken in the street. And so, when the opportunity came to study abroad, she embraced it with the eagerness of someone who had long listened for the music of another world. Paris opened itself to her, like a long-awaited confidant. The city was a living text, a manuscript of centuries in stone and light. She walked its boulevards as if retracing passages she had already studied, recognizing in the architecture the grandeur of histories she had read, and in its rhythm the vitality she craved. Jackie absorbed it all: the art in museums, the debates of students, the taste of wines, the subtleties of gesture and dress. Her French became fluent, her sensibilities sharpened, her sense of self expanded. Paris did not merely refine her, it confirmed something that had long stirred within her, that she was made for a stage larger than the confines of her own society. Those who saw her in Paris spoke of a young woman who seemed at once American and European, both rooted and cosmopolitan. She carried herself with a grace that was natural yet cultivated, a grace that suggested she was already preparing for a life that would demand much of appearances, yet that was never merely appearance. In her essays, she wrote of history, of philosophy, of art, always seeking to penetrate to some truth beyond the surface. Yet she was also playful, taking in the humor of life, sketching observations of people she met, noting their gestures, their small vanities, their hidden longings. She was becoming not only a student but an observer of humanity, a role she would carry throughout her life, often silently, as though the world were a stage upon which she played her part, while also keeping careful notes. Paris imprinted upon her a love of refinement that would never fade. She returned often in memory, and later in life would speak of it as the happiest of her youth. The fragrance of its gardens lingered in her, the sound of its bells, the rustle of its trees. Perhaps it was there that she discovered her ability to shape identity through style, to craft an image that spoke as powerfully as words. For in Paris she saw how dress, manners, and subtle choices could become art forms, languages of their own, and Jackie, ever observant, learned to speak them fluently. Her time abroad also introduced her to the complexity of history, not as distant fact, but as living presence. She walked streets where revolutions had stirred, where empires had risen and fallen, and she felt herself small within the vast sweep of time. Perhaps it was this awareness that later gave her the ability to endure tragedy with such composure, an understanding that individual lives, however brilliant, were but threads in a vast tapestry. Yet she did not retreat into insignificance. Instead, she embraced the role of one who could embody grace within history, who could carry herself in a way that seemed to echo centuries of refinement. When she returned to America, she brought with her not only the polish of Paris, but a certain detachment. She saw her own society with new eyes, with a sharper sense of what it valued and what it lacked. Friends noted her cosmopolitan air, her elegance that seemed touched by something foreign yet familiar. She was no longer merely a debutante or a promising student. She was a woman who had tasted a broader world, and she carried that knowledge like a hidden jewel. At Vassar and beyond, she continued to excel, winning a prestigious prize for an essay she wrote about France. In that essay, one glimpses the depth of her observation, her ability to link culture with character, history with destiny. She was fascinated by how nations shaped identities, and how individuals in turn could shape nations. Such thoughts would return later, when she stood as First Lady, shaping the cultural image of America through her restoration of the White House, her state visits, her mastery of symbolism. But in her youth, they were simply the musings of a young woman who saw connections others might overlook. The gardens of Paris lingered with her, even as she returned to American soil. Their fragrance seemed to travel in her memory, mingling with the sound of American voices, the clatter of American cities, the expectations of American society. She carried them like a secret, a reminder of a life more expansive than the one that awaited her. And perhaps it was this secret, this fragrance, that gave her the aura of mystery so many later remarked upon. She was present, yet always slightly elsewhere, as though part of her still walked the shaded paths of Paris, hearing the rustle of leaves and the murmur of fountains. As evening falls upon this stage of her life, we linger with that image of her in Paris, the young Jacqueline, poised at the threshold of her future, breathing in the scent of gardens, listening to the distant bells. The fragrance does not vanish but drifts forward, carrying us toward another meeting, another step in her becoming, when she would encounter the ambitious young senator from Massachusetts whose destiny would entwine with hers. And so, the gardens fade, but their perfume remains, leading us to the sound of wedding bells that would soon toll in the distance. The fragrance of gardens, still lingering from Paris, drifts gently into the sound of wedding bells, distant at first and then louder, tolling across years that carried Jacqueline Bouvier from the quiet observation of a student into the public gaze of history. It was through Paris that she came to understand refinement, and through her return to America that she came to understand expectation. An expectation, silent and relentless, often leads a young woman of her station to a marriage that is as much arrangement as affection. In the crowded rooms of Washington, with their murmur of ambition and their air of smoke and polished shoes, she encountered John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a man already marked by destiny and already shadowed by fragility. He was magnetic, handsome, with that tousled hair and that boyish grin that seemed to disarm even those who distrusted him. Yet behind the charm was a body often in pain, a back injured in war, an illness that stalked him quietly, and an ambition that burned with unusual intensity. Their courtship was not the simple tale of romance sung in soft verses. It was deliberate, calculated in part by families, admired by society, and watched with interest by those who knew the future might hinge upon such a union. Jackie, for all her youth, was not naive. She understood the power of appearances, the necessity of alliances, the way in which personal life and public destiny could become inseparable. To marry Jack Kennedy was to enter not only a household but a dynasty, not only a family but a cause. She considered carefully, weighing the solitude she valued against the role she would inevitably be asked to play. Perhaps in her quiet hours, she wondered whether she was walking into a life chosen for her rather than by her. And yet, perhaps too, she recognized in him a reflection of her own reserve, a man who carried both charm and distance, who understood that a life lived for the public was always a mask of sorts. The wedding itself was a spectacle, a gathering of thousands covered by newspapers and magazines, celebrated as the union of beauty and power, grace and ambition. The bells rang, the crowds gathered, the photographs captured a radiant bride in white, her smile luminous, her presence serene. And yet, beneath the veil of ceremony, what private thoughts stirred in her? Did she imagine herself stepping into a fairy tale, or did she already sense that fairy tales in the real world come entwined with burdens? She was adored, admired, envied. She was, in that moment, the embodiment of a dream. But dreams are fragile things, and they are often haunted by shadows unseen. The early years of their marriage revealed both tenderness and fracture. Jack was affectionate, playful, yet also restless, distracted, driven by politics and by appetites that often strayed beyond the boundaries of fidelity. Jackie, who had observed much in her youth, chose silence rather than confrontation. Perhaps she understood that to hold the image intact required endurance rather than protest. Her role became one of balance, to preserve grace even when grace was tested, to hold the family together even when the family strained under the weight of ambition. The miscarriages she endured in those years, the losses of pregnancies, were sorrows carried quietly, sorrows that seldom reached the public ear. To be young, to long for children, and to endure such grief in silence, this too shaped her. This too taught her that dignity is often born from suffering hidden away. Washington society adored her. She was not loud, not eager to dominate conversations. But when she entered a room, heads turned. Her elegance was not flamboyant but subtle, a refinement that seemed natural, as if she were born to glide through the corridors of power without effort. Yet behind that composure was a woman adjusting, often lonely, sometimes uncertain. She read voraciously, studied history, cultivated her knowledge of art and culture, finding in those pursuits a refuge from the demands of political life. She was preparing herself, though perhaps she did not yet know it, for the role that would come, the role of First Lady, where her knowledge of history and her sense of culture would be wielded not only for herself but for the nation. Marriages such as theirs raise questions that linger in the minds of observers. Was it love that bound them, or duty, or ambition? Was it admiration or the recognition that together they could create an image larger than either could alone? History seldom answers such questions, for only the two within the marriage can truly know, and even they may find the answer shifting over time. Perhaps it was all of these at once: love, admiration, duty, ambition. Perhaps it was none of them in purity, but all of them in mixture. Jackie herself, later in life, would speak tenderly of Jack, remembering him with affection and sorrow. Whatever disappointments lay between them, whatever betrayals, there remained also a bond that survived tragedy and became immortalized in grief. As the years of their early marriage unfolded, the sound of bells lingered like an echo in the background. They were no longer merely the bells of a wedding day, but the bells of destiny, tolling slowly, preparing to announce a presidency, preparing to usher them into a realm where private sorrows and public spectacles would become inseparably entwined. Jackie, still so young, was learning to walk with grace upon the tightrope stretched between her inner life and the unblinking gaze of the world. Each step she took was measured, each gesture polished, each silence filled with meaning. She had begun her life as a girl riding horses in East Hampton, had wandered the gardens of Paris with notebooks and dreams, and now she found herself the wife of a man whose ambitions carried him toward the White House. The bells rang faintly but insistently, and with each chime her life moved further into history's unyielding current. And so, as this part of her story settles into stillness, We leave her standing in the glow of wedding photographs, her veil still fresh, her smile luminous, her path ahead uncertain but unstoppable. The bells of her wedding fade slowly, lingering in the ear, and as they fade, we hear another sound rising in their place. The restless murmur of corridors in Washington, the shuffle of polished shoes, the distant cry of a child. The bells of her wedding fade into the restless murmur of corridors in Washington, the shuffle of polished shoes, the steady murmur of aides and politicians, and through it all the faint cry of a child rising and falling like a fragile thread of sound. Jacqueline Kennedy had now stepped fully into the sphere of politics, into a marriage intertwined with ambition, and her days were no longer her own. The city watched her, admired her, whispered about her, but within the walls of her private life another rhythm unfolded, quieter, filled with the joys and sorrows of motherhood and the trials of a young wife learning to carry burdens in silence. She was radiant to the public eye, her elegance noted in newspapers, her style already imitated, but behind the scenes, her life was marked by shadows that seldom reached the surface. Her pregnancies, so longed for, often ended in sorrow. The miscarriages were hidden, spoken of only in hushed tones, endured with the poise that she had learned since childhood, but felt deeply in the solitude of her heart. When Caroline was born, she became a source of light, a fragile blossom in Jackie's world, but the joy of holding her daughter was tempered by the earlier losses that still haunted her. To be both a mother and a figure of society required balance that few could sustain, and yet she did so, appearing serene in public while carrying unspoken grief within. She knew, perhaps more keenly than most, that the image one presents to the world can never reveal the whole of the soul. The corridors of Washington were not places of peace. They were restless with ambition, alive with calculation, filled with voices that measured loyalty, opportunity, and gain. John Kennedy thrived in this environment, his charisma dazzling, his ambition unrelenting, his presence magnetic to men and women alike. Jackie, however, often felt the loneliness of being tethered to such a life. She attended functions, smiled when required, dressed with care, but her heart was often elsewhere. In books, in the quiet hours with Carolyn, in the solitude where she could write, read, and breathe without the scrutiny of cameras. She once confessed that she was ill-suited to the endless dinners and ceremonies, preferring instead the company of ideas, of art, of history. And yet she fulfilled her role with grace, not because she loved it, but because she understood its necessity. The strain of her husband's infidelities, whispered about even then, was another weight she bore. She knew of them, as women in her position often did, but she chose silence. To confront would have risked the fragile equilibrium of their public image, and perhaps she already understood that her power lay not in confrontation, but in endurance. Grace became her armor, and silence her weapon. To many observers, her composure was mystifying, but within it was the quiet resolve of someone who had accepted that life in politics was never truly one's own. Her childhood had taught her that appearances must be preserved even when the reality beneath them falters, and now that lesson became her way of surviving marriage to a man whose ambitions required constant motion. And yet there were moments of tenderness, glimpses of affection that revealed the bond beneath the fractures. John was playful with Caroline, and Jackie's heart softened in those moments, remembering that beyond the public man there was a husband and father who, in flashes, was simply human. They laughed together at times, found comfort in shared silences, and built a family that, however imperfect, carried genuine love. The Kennedy household was both fortress and stage, filled with laughter and shadows, with ambition and vulnerability. Jackie moved through it with the grace of someone aware that she was both participant and observer in a story larger than herself. Her presence in Washington was not only as wife and mother, but as a figure who began to captivate the public imagination. Women admired her style, the way she carried herself, the elegance she seemed to summon effortlessly. Men admired her beauty, her refinement, her air of mystery. She became, even before the White House years, an icon in formation. Yet Jackie herself remained detached from such adoration. She dressed as she pleased, cultivated her taste not to impress, but to remain true to herself, though she understood that her choices would inevitably ripple outward. In this way, she began to shape not only her own image, but the image of her husband, for together they were seen as the young, glamorous couple who embodied the future. But glamour, as always, was shadowed by reality. The private pains of miscarriage, the strain of public scrutiny, the weight of infidelity, all these wove into her life in Washington, even as the world saw only her poise. When she lost her infant son, Patrick, later on, the grief was so deep it nearly crushed her, but even before that, she had already carried losses that etched lines of sorrow within her soul. To endure such experiences while maintaining elegance was no small feat. It was the kind of endurance that turned women into legends, though Jackie never sought such a fate. She longed only for a measure of peace, for the comfort of family, for the quiet of a life that would never truly be hers again. The corridors of Washington hummed with ambition, but within them Jackie remained a figure apart, moving gracefully yet always slightly distant, as though holding part of herself in reserve. That distance became part of her allure, the mystery that the world would never fully unravel. She was present but never entirely accessible, admired but never fully known. Perhaps she understood that to preserve herself, she must keep something hidden, some inner sanctuary untouched by the gaze of others. It was this sanctuary that sustained her through the years of Washington life, through the loneliness, through the sorrows. And so the cry of a child, faint yet persistent, continues to echo through these restless corridors, carrying us forward toward another transformation, toward the moment when Jackie would step not merely into Washington society, but into the White House itself, when her role as wife and mother would expand into that of First Lady, when the world would come to see not only her elegance, but her ability to shape history's image of America. For now, we leave her walking those corridors, Caroline's small hand in hers, her expression serene yet shadowed, the murmur of ambition surrounding her like an unending tide. The child's cry fades into the distance, and in its place, we hear the flash of camera bulbs, the beginning of a new stage, the dawning of Camelot. The faint cry of a child fades, and in its place rises the blinding flare of camera bulbs, the harsh white light that would follow Jacqueline Kennedy into every corridor of power and every corner of her life. The years of Washington society had prepared her, but nothing could fully prepare a woman for the transformation that came when John Fitzgerald Kennedy became the 35th President of the United States. With the oath of office spoken, with the cold January air sweeping across the Capitol steps, Jackie was no longer simply a senator's wife, no longer a young mother balancing private grief and public duty. She was First Lady, an image projected to the world, a mirror of a nation's aspirations, a living emblem of what many hoped America could be, young, vibrant, elegant, and full of promise. From the beginning, she understood her role not merely as ceremonial, but as cultural. Jackie saw the White House not as a residence of transient occupants, but as a stage upon which the story of America was told. She walked its rooms and felt the emptiness of history unacknowledged, the sense that too much of the past had been allowed to fade, and so she began her Great Restoration, a project that was both aesthetic and symbolic. She searched for furniture, for art, for objects that would return the White House to its rightful dignity, not only as the home of presidents, but as a living museum of the nation's heritage. She labored quietly yet insistently, contacting collectors, negotiating with curators, appealing to donors. Her vision was meticulous, born of her love of history and her sense that culture was not ornament, but identity. In February of 1962, she unveiled her work to the nation in a televised tour. Millions watched as she guided them through the restored rooms, her voice calm, her presence serene, her knowledge precise. She spoke of American history with the tone of a careful steward, reminding citizens that the house belonged to them, that its legacy was theirs to cherish. For many, it was a revelation. They saw in her not only beauty and refinement, but intelligence, dedication, and a reverence for tradition that transcended politics. She became not only a First Lady, but a custodian of memory, shaping how the nation saw itself through the space it called its own. Her influence extended beyond walls and furniture. Jackie embodied a new vision of style that captured the imagination of the world. Her dresses, her pillbox hats, her simple yet refined silhouettes became symbols of an era. Designers worked with her, but she shaped the vision herself, favoring clean lines, subtle elegance, an aesthetic that spoke of sophistication without ostentation. Women across America, across Europe, across continents looked to her as a model, imitating her hair, her clothing, her grace. She was, in many ways, the first truly global First Lady, admired not only at home but abroad. Her image as carefully studied in Paris as in New York, in London as in Tokyo. And yet, beneath the admiration, she remained enigmatic. Style was not for her mere decoration. It was a language, a shield, a way of communicating dignity and poise even when her inner life was marked by solitude. The world fell in love with her. Crowds cheered not only for the president, but for his wife, who brought with her the aura of refinement. On state visits, she spoke French fluently, charmed leaders with her composure, and drew headlines that often overshadowed even her husband. In Paris, John Kennedy famously introduced himself as the man who had accompanied Jackie. Such moments revealed not only her charisma, but her ability to embody something larger than herself, to become a symbol of America's cultural ambition, its desire to be not only powerful but graceful, not only strong but admired. Yet even in those luminous years, shadows lingered. Behind the glamour, Jackie's life was marked by fragility. She bore the strains of pregnancies, of miscarriages, of the loss of a son, Patrick, who lived only a few days. These sorrows were endured privately, with the same composure she showed publicly, but they deepened her air of mystery, the sense that beneath her smile lay grief unspoken. John's infidelities continued, known but rarely acknowledged, endured in silence. The White House, gleaming with restored history and filled with laughter and ceremony, was also a place of loneliness for its First Lady. Yet she transformed that loneliness into work, into a vision that has endured for decades. The notion of Camelot was not hers, not spoken until after Dallas, but even in those years, there was something of that mythic glow. The young president, the elegant First Lady, the children, Caroline and John Jr., playing in the halls of the White House. The images captured by photographers seemed to suggest a dream, a golden age, a vision of possibility. And Jackie, with her keen sense of symbolism, contributed to that image, curating not only the White House, but her family's presentation to the world. She knew the power of image, the way it could comfort, inspire, and endure, even when reality was less perfect. She had grown up learning the importance of appearances, and now she used that lesson not for herself alone, but for a nation. And so the camera bulbs flashed, capturing her in gowns at state dinners, in quiet moments with her children, in poised interviews that revealed little yet conveyed much. She became, in many ways, the guardian of silence. She revealed only what she wished, always with grace, always with restraint. This, too, was part of her art, the art of remaining enigmatic, of being seen without being fully known. Perhaps that is why the world never ceased to be fascinated by her, why she remained an icon long after others faded. for Jackie understood that mystery is as powerful as presence. As we linger in this chapter of her life, we see her walking the halls of the White House, the rooms filled now with paintings and furniture that speak of history, the air alive with the voices of diplomats and musicians, the laughter of children echoing against marble floors. She moves through it all with elegance, with an aura of calm that conceals both sorrow and strength. She is the First Lady, but she is also the eternal observer, the quiet writer who once walked the gardens of Paris, now shaping the gardens of a nation's memory. The flash of camera bulbs does not fade. It grows more insistent, relentless, and within its brightness we glimpse the shadows gathering at the edges of Camelot. For though the dream seemed golden, it was never immune to darkness. As we prepare to move forward, the light of the camera begins to dim, leaving behind the rustle of secret papers, the whispers of illness and betrayal, the subtle cracks in the shining image. The brightness of the camera bulbs fades, leaving only the rustle of secret papers, the sound of documents being folded and slipped into drawers, the whisper of correspondence exchanged behind closed doors. For beneath the radiance of Camelot lay shadows that were always present, shadows that Jackie Kennedy felt keenly though she seldom revealed them. Her husband, the young president whose image captivated the world, was not free of frailty. His back caused him constant pain, an injury from the war compounded by illness, his body often dependent on medications administered quietly by physicians who came and went like discreet phantoms in the White House halls. Jackie, ever observant, witnessed this fragility and must have understood that the image of vitality projected to the world was in truth precarious, that the man adored by millions was vulnerable, fragile, human, in ways the public would never wish to imagine. At the same time, she bore the sting of betrayals that were not whispered to her, but known nonetheless. John Kennedy's appetite for the company of other women was not hidden from those close to him, and Jackie could not have been blind to it. Yet she spoke little, confided less, enduring with a composure that perplexed and even unsettled those who tried to understand her. Was it resignation, or calculation, or a kind of resistance born from silence? Perhaps it was all of these. She had grown up in a world where appearances mattered more than truths, where families papered over fractures to preserve their standing. Now, as First Lady, she took that lesson to its highest form. Grace became her response to betrayal, poise her answer to pain. Her silence was not weakness but a kind of weapon, an unyielding refusal to let scandal define her. For Jackie understood better than most that power is not always loud. Power can also be still, unspoken, wrapped in elegance that confounds those who wish to provoke reaction. In her quiet, she preserved dignity not only for herself but for the presidency, for the nation. Yet one wonders what it cost her in solitude, what unvoiced sorrow she carried in those silent hours between public appearances. Did she lie awake at night, hearing the footsteps in the corridors, feeling the distance of a husband whose presence belonged more to history than to her? Or did she retreat inward, into the sanctuary of her children, into the comfort of literature and art, into the fortress of her own interior life that no betrayal could touch? The rustle of papers continues, now the sound of memos exchanged, of policy debated, of secrets guarded. Jackie was not part of the political machinery in any direct sense, but she was present in its shadows. She saw the strain on her husband, the weight of decisions made in crisis, the sleepless nights when the world seemed to teeter on the edge of destruction, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the cold stare of the Soviet Union, the restless tide of civil rights. These were the matters that filled the papers piled upon desks in the West Wing. Jackie was not a politician, yet she was witness to the human cost of politics. She knew what it meant for her husband to carry the burden of history on his shoulders, even as his body betrayed him, even as his private life frayed the bond of their marriage. She remained at his side, not with words, but with presence. A stillness that steadied him even when their relationship was marked by distance. Friends who visited the White House often remarked on the atmosphere Jackie created. She filled its rooms not only with historical treasures, but with music, with art, with a sense of culture that softened the hardness of politics. It was not trivial, this effort. It was her way of infusing humanity into the machinery of power, of reminding those within those walls that history was not only battles and laws, but also beauty, memory, and refinement. Perhaps it was also her way of balancing the shadows she endured, the betrayals, the illnesses, the loneliness, with something luminous, something enduring. She could not change her husband's nature, nor could she prevent the storms of politics, but she could create an environment that reflected her own vision of dignity. And yet, beneath the music and the art, beneath the elegance of dinners and the glamour of state visits, the rustle of papers never ceased. Rumors circulated, secrets were kept, truths were hidden from the public. Jackie's life was bound to these layers of concealment, to the necessity of maintaining images at all costs. She became a master of it, a woman who could smile at photographers while her heart carried grief, who could speak softly to reporters while her mind retreated to places untouched by their questions. She revealed only what she chose, and in that selective revelation lay her strength. She was both known and unknowable, present yet distant, admired yet never fully grasped. Some would later interpret her silence as complicity, others as resignation. But perhaps it was something deeper. Perhaps Jackie understood that life is seldom as simple as judgment allows. To endure, to preserve dignity, to maintain the image that sustained a nation's hope. These were not acts of passivity, but of quiet resolve. Her silence was layered with meaning, her poise heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. She was not merely surviving, she was shaping how history would see her, and through her, how it would see an era. The rustle of papers becomes, at last, the whisper of wind, the faint stirring of air through the streets of Dallas, where those papers would soon scatter like leaves in the wake of violence. For even as Jackie held her silence, even as she endured the shadows of illness and betrayal, destiny was moving swiftly toward its breaking point. The glamour of Camelot, the composure of the First Lady, the carefully preserved images, all would soon be shattered by the sound of gunfire. But for now, we linger with her in the White House, her presence steady, her silence unbroken, her dignity intact, as the wind begins to rise, carrying with it the whisper of what is to come. The rustle of papers becomes the whisper of wind, carrying us into the streets of Dallas, where sunlight gleamed upon the polished cars of the motorcade, and crowds gathered in hope, waving flags and handkerchiefs with innocent delight. The day was warm, the air clear, and for many it seemed a day of celebration, a chance to see the young president and his elegant wife. Jackie, radiant in her pink suit with the pillbox hat perched lightly upon her dark hair, sat beside John, her face composed, her presence serene. She had chosen the suit carefully, knowing its brightness would photograph well, knowing it would convey cheer to the crowds who gathered. There was little reason to expect that this day of all days would dissolve into tragedy so profound that it would freeze her forever in memory. The motorcade moved slowly through the streets, the cheering of the people rising and falling like waves against the shore. Jackie smiled, her white gloves lifting slightly in greeting, her eyes alert but calm. She had played this role many times, the consort to a man whose life belonged to the people, her own life therefore no longer her own. And yet, in that moment, she was simply present, taking in the faces, the warmth, the ordinary joy of those who watched. Perhaps she thought of her children, of how these journeys always took her away from them, of how fragile and fleeting ordinary days could be. She could not have known how quickly her own would vanish. And then, Without warning came the sound that split time, the crack of a rifle shot, sharp, metallic, final. For a breath, the world did not move. Then came another, and another. The president collapsed beside her, his body jolted by the force, his head struck, the color of life spilling into her lap. The crowd screamed, scattered, fell silent, then screamed again. The motorcade accelerated, chaos erupting as agents leapt into motion, as sirens began their wail. But Jackie did not scream. She did not faint. She bent over her husband, her hands instinctively reaching, as though her own small body could shield him from the force of what had already been done. Her pink suit darkened with blood, the vivid stain spreading across the fabric like an indelible script. Those who witnessed her in that moment spoke of her stillness, her composure in the midst of horror. She whispered softly, though her words are lost to time. Some said she tried to gather pieces of what had been taken, as if to preserve even fragments of the man she loved. Others said she remained in disbelief, unable to accept what her eyes had seen. But all agreed that she did not waver, that her poise did not break even as the world collapsed around her. Her silence spoke more than any cry could have, her presence more haunting than any gesture of despair. She was, in that moment, the embodiment of grief itself, visible to millions who would never forget the sight. At the hospital, she refused to leave his side. She followed as doctors carried him inside, her gloves and suit stained, her face pale but unbroken. She was asked to change, to cleanse herself of the blood that marked her, but she refused. "Let them see what they have done," she is said to have answered, her voice low, steady, final. She understood the power of image, the necessity of testimony. Her very body had become the witness, and she would not erase it. In that refusal lay both defiance and mourning, a recognition that history was watching and must not look away. On Air Force One, as Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president, Jackie stood beside him, her suit still stained, her presence dignified in its quiet horror. Photographs captured her in that moment, her face serene yet emptied, her eyes gazing far beyond the cabin of the plane. The ceremony that marked the transition of power was as much about her silence as it was about Johnson's words. She carried the grief of a nation upon her shoulders, her stained suit a symbol not only of loss but of witness, of the irrevocable fracture in time. And yet, even in those hours, she thought of her children. She knew that Caroline and John Jr. would grow up with their father as memory rather than presence, that their lives had been altered as irrevocably as hers. She held them in her thoughts even as she held the nation in her poise. For Jackie's grief was not only public, but private, not only symbolic, but intimate. The man who had laughed with her, who had held her, who had been her companion through sorrows and joys, was gone. And yet she was asked, by the cruel necessity of history, to remain composed, to offer dignity in the face of devastation. She did so without faltering, and in doing so, she entered forever into the realm of myth. The image of Jackie in Dallas is one the world cannot release. The pink suit, the blood, the silence, it is etched into the memory of generations, a tableau of tragedy that speaks of both fragility and endurance. Was it strength that held her still, or was it shock, disbelief, the paralysis of grief? No answer can be certain, but perhaps it is precisely the ambiguity that haunts us, that compels us to return to that moment again and again. For in her silence, we hear our own questions, our own confrontation with the incomprehensible. As the plane carried them back to Washington, as night descended upon a nation stunned into mourning, Jackie remained a figure of stillness. She had not chosen this role. It had been thrust upon her by fate, yet she bore it with a composure that transformed her into an icon of sorrow, a woman who stood at the very center of history's storm and refused to be undone. The whisper of wind in Dallas lingers, echoing into eternity, carrying us now toward the days that followed, the solemn march of a funeral, the sound of muffled drums, the sight of a riderless horse, and the small, heartbreaking salute of a child too young to understand yet destined to be remembered. The whisper of wind in Dallas drifts into the hush of Washington, where the streets fell into mourning, and where the slow cadence of muffled drums began to carry the weight of a nation's grief. Jacqueline Kennedy, still cloaked in her blood-stained suit until the hours demanded she change, stepped now into the role of widow before millions of watching eyes. Her husband's body was returned to the Capitol, placed in the East Room of the White House, the very home that she had restored to a monument of history, and now it became a house of mourning. The air was thick with flowers and incense, with silence broken only by footsteps and prayers whispered through tears. She stood beside the casket, stillness itself, her children brought to her side, their small hands clinging, their eyes searching for comfort in a world they could not yet understand. The funeral became more than a private farewell. It became a ritual for a wounded people. Heads of state from across the world came to Washington, their footsteps echoing against marble floors, their faces grave, their gestures subdued. Kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers marched in solemn procession, united not in politics, but in mourning. They came not only to honor John Kennedy, but to bear witness to the dignity of the young widow who carried herself with such quiet strength. Jackie, veiled in black, moved with a grace that seemed beyond human endurance, her children at her side, her composure unbroken. She had become the vessel of a nation's grief, the mirror in which millions saw their own sorrow reflected. Outside, the funeral procession moved slowly through the streets, the sound of drums muffled, the cadence steady, as if time itself had been slowed. The coffin draped in the flag, the horse-drawn caisson rolling along, the riderless horse walking behind, its stirrups reversed, its hooves striking the pavement with echoes that reverberated in the hearts of all who watched. The image was stark, symbolic, unforgettable. A nation bereft, its leader gone, its hope extinguished, yet still holding on to ritual and dignity as anchors in the storm. Jackie walked with her children, their small figures a tender wound upon the grandeur of the ceremony. And then came the moment that pierced all hearts, the salute of young John Jr., barely 3 years old, lifting his small hand as the coffin passed. It was a gesture simple in form yet infinite in its sorrow, a gesture that seemed to capture the innocence of childhood, colliding with the enormity of death. The image seared itself into memory, as eternal as his mother's stillness in Dallas. Jackie had chosen carefully how the funeral would unfold, drawing upon history, upon Lincoln's funeral, upon the rituals that connected one generation to another. She shaped the ceremony not only for her husband, but for the nation, weaving together sorrow and symbolism so that grief could find its form in ritual. Her choices were not incidental. They were deliberate acts of memory, ensuring that John Kennedy's death would not dissolve into chaos, but would instead be sanctified by history. Yet what of her own grief hidden behind the veil? What of the silence she carried, the sorrow she endured privately while the world consumed her public image? Few knew the depth of her pain in those days, for she revealed little. Some said she did not cry where others could see. Some said her voice remained calm, her gestures controlled, even as she stood at the edge of loss too great to bear. Perhaps she understood that her grief was not her own to display, that it belonged also to the millions who looked to her for strength. Perhaps she chose silence not only as armor, but as gift, giving the people a figure of dignity in which they could find solace. Inside her, however, the weight must have been crushing. She had loved her husband, despite the betrayals, despite the loneliness, despite the fractures of their marriage. He had been hers in ways no one else could understand, and she had been his, sharing in his dreams, in his ambitions, in his triumphs, and in his sorrows. To lose him so suddenly, so violently, was to be torn from the very fabric of her life, and yet she bore it with a poise that astonished even those who knew her best. Her strength became legend, her stillness became myth, her dignity became the standard against which others would forever be measured. The tolling of church bells accompanied the funeral mass, their deep notes reverberating through the city, through the nation, through the hearts of all who listened from afar. The bells spoke of endings and of remembrance, of the solemnity of death and the endurance of memory. Jackie sat in the front pew, her children beside her, her black veil falling softly over her face, her posture upright, her silence profound. The service unfolded with ritual precision, yet in every detail one felt her hand, her insistence that her husband's death be honored with the dignity of history itself. She had given him, in death, a place among the immortals, and in doing so she herself had entered into that realm. When the coffin was lowered into the earth at Arlington National Cemetery, an eternal flame was lit, a fire that Jackie herself insisted upon, a flame that would burn without end as symbol and as vigil. She bent to light it, her black figure stooping toward the ground, her children watching. The flame caught, flickered, and then held, a fragile yet enduring light in the darkness of grief. That flame, more than any words, became her offering to him, to the nation, to history. It was the symbol of her sorrow, her love, her resolve. And so the funeral ended, the drums ceased, the bells grew quiet, the crowds dispersed. But the image of Jackie, veiled and dignified, walking with her children, lighting the eternal flame, remained etched in the world's imagination. She had carried herself through the unimaginable, and in doing so, had given form to grief, had turned sorrow into ritual, had woven tragedy into memory. The tolling of the bells fades slowly now, leaving us with silence once more, a silence heavy and unresolved, a silence that carries us toward the sea, where Jackie would seek refuge, where the sound of waves would murmur against her solitude, where public mourning would give way to private sorrow. The tolling of the bells fades, their echoes dissolving into stillness, and in their place rises the murmur of the sea, the eternal rhythm of waves breaking against the shore. After the funeral, after the drums and the salutes and the eternal flame was lit at Arlington, Jacqueline Kennedy sought the solace of the ocean. The sea had always been part of her life. Its breezes in East Hampton during her childhood, its glittering expanse glimpsed from the decks of yachts, its whispers in the places she loved. Now it became a refuge, a vast and patient companion whose endless motion mirrored both the restlessness and the constancy of her grief. In the months following Dallas, Jackie was no longer merely a widow. She was the focus of the world's mourning, a figure admired and pitied, watched and written about, her every movement scrutinized for meaning. She carried herself through those days with the same quiet poise she had shown on that terrible afternoon, but the weight of such attention was suffocating. Paparazzi trailed her. Newspapers speculated about her future. Strangers felt entitled to her sorrow. Yet what she longed for was not the gaze of nations, but the private silence in which to grieve, to comfort her children, to gather fragments of a life broken apart. It was in the rhythm of waves, in the salt air, that she found a measure of stillness. For Caroline and John Jr., too young to fully comprehend their loss, she created a sanctuary of love. She shielded them from the relentless intrusion of the outside world, striving to give them moments of normal childhood amid the chaos. She read to them, played with them, guided them through days that must have felt confusing and heavy with absence. Their laughter was precious, a reminder that life still pulsed forward, even in the shadow of tragedy. For Jackie, their presence was both anchor and balm, the reason to rise each morning, the reason to carry on when her own heart wished only to retreat into silence. The sea itself seemed to speak to her, its vastness a reminder of both insignificance and eternity. Each wave broke and vanished, yet the rhythm endured, as if telling her that grief too would change shape, but never truly disappear. Standing at the shore, she might have wondered how one human life, her husband's, could so suddenly be taken while the ocean rolled on, indifferent yet consoling in its persistence. Perhaps she listened to the waves as if they were voices of history, whispering that sorrow, though immense, was part of the eternal pattern. Yet even as she sought privacy, she could never escape the gaze of the world. Photographers hid in dunes, in boats, in cars, capturing her in black, veiled, walking with her children, staring out at the sea. Each image fed the hunger of a public that both mourned with her and consumed her grief as spectacle. Jackie must have felt the cruelty of it, the impossibility of claiming even sorrow as her own. She had become a public monument to tragedy, and though she bore it with grace, the cost was immense. To be forced to share grief with strangers, to have mourning turned into image, was perhaps as unbearable as the loss itself. Still, she found strength in creating rituals of her own. Letters she wrote during those months reveal a woman who reflected deeply, who sought meaning even amid despair. She compared her life to that of widows in history, sought to understand her fate within a larger pattern, to weave her personal loss into the fabric of time. In doing so, she found a measure of distance, a way of turning agony into something she could bear. To see her tragedy not as random, but as part of history's relentless turning may have offered her the strength to endure. For Jackie, sorrow was never only personal, it was symbolic, intertwined with her sense of history, her instinct to curate meaning. Just as she had restored the White House to tell the story of America, so she now sought to shape her husband's legacy, to ensure he was remembered not only as a fallen leader, but as part of a larger myth. She spoke of Camelot, invoking the words of a Broadway musical, yet imbuing them with the resonance of legend. She presented his presidency as a golden moment, brief and brilliant, cut short but never forgotten. In doing so, she gave the people a narrative in which to place their grief, a story that ennobled loss and transformed sorrow into memory. It was her gift to him, to the nation, and to herself. But legends cannot replace loneliness. In the quiet of nights, when the children slept and the house fell silent, she must have felt the ache of absence in its rawest form. The bed where he once lay was empty. The laughter, the conversations, the presence of a husband, even with all his flaws, were gone. She bore this not with tears for others to see, but in solitude, where grief could be felt without restraint. She had become the eternal First Lady, the figure of dignity, but within her was still a woman bereft, a wife widowed far too young. The sea, in its infinite patience, bore witness. The waves rose and fell, whispering to her as they had whispered to countless souls before her. Did she ask the sea her questions, the unanswerable ones that haunted her? Why him? Why so soon? Why in such violence? Did she hear, in the crash of water, a reply that was not an answer, but a reminder that some mysteries are eternal, that grief itself is part of the human condition, unresolvable, carried until the end? She clung to her children, to her memories, to the rituals of remembrance. She guarded her husband's legacy with fierce devotion, yet guarded her own inner life even more tightly. The world wanted her story, but she offered only fragments, only what she chose. The rest remained locked away, carried like a secret, like a treasure she refused to let the world consume. This secrecy was her strength, the hidden sanctuary where she could preserve herself. And so the sound of the waves lingers, steady and unresolved, carrying her into the next stage of her life, when the sea would no longer be enough, when her solitude would be broken by a new presence, one that shocked and scandalized the world. Aristotle Onassis, the man whose wealth and power would offer her safety, but would also bind her to yet another set of shadows. The waves break once more, and amid their rhythm, the clink of glasses on a yacht begins to sound, ushering her into the next chapter of her long and enigmatic journey. The murmur of waves, steady and eternal, shifts now into the clink of glasses on the deck of a yacht, the sound of polished silver meeting crystal, of laughter carried across Mediterranean waters. It was in this setting that Jacqueline Kennedy, widow of a slain president and guardian of a nation's grief, entered into a union that startled the world. Aristotle Onassis was a name already wrapped in legend, a Greek shipping magnate whose fortune rivaled empires, whose reputation was one of audacity, power, and scandal. He was decades older than Jackie, wealthy beyond measure, accustomed to bending the world to his will. Their marriage in 1968, just 5 years after Dallas, was greeted not with celebration, but with gasps, criticism, and bewilderment. To many, Jackie's choice seemed inconceivable. How could the eternal widow of Camelot, the sacred vessel of national sorrow, marry a man whom society saw as vulgar, ostentatious, foreign to the myth America had built around her? But to judge her choice by appearances is to forget the weight she bore. By the late 1960s, Jackie had endured more than most souls could carry. She had lost her husband in the most brutal fashion, lived through the relentless glare of the public eye, shielded her children from ceaseless intrusion, and watched as the world consumed her grief as spectacle. She had also suffered the assassination of her brother-in-law, Robert Kennedy, another violent rupture in a family already marked by tragedy. By then she was haunted by fear, convinced that the Kennedy curse would not rest until it consumed all those she loved. She told friends she married Onassis for protection, that he was the only man powerful enough to shield her and her children from the dangers that seemed to stalk them. Safety, not romance, was the true dowry of this marriage. The world did not understand, or perhaps it refused to. Newspapers called her Jackie O, a name tinged with mockery, as if she had betrayed the sanctity of her widowhood. Admirers of Camelot felt abandoned, as though their icon had stepped down from the pedestal upon which they had placed her. But Jackie had never asked to be an icon. She had never chosen to be the vessel of a nation's dream. What she chose, in marrying Onassis, was survival, stability, the possibility of raising her children away from the constant threat of violence and intrusion. Love, if it existed, was a quiet and complicated thing, but necessity was undeniable. Life with Onassis was one of luxury, yet also of exile. She sailed on his yachts, walked the marble halls of his villas, traveled between islands and capitals. She had wealth at her fingertips, more than even the Kennedys had offered, but wealth was never her true longing. What she sought was distance, protection, the chance to breathe without the gaze of millions. Onassis adored her in his way, showering her with jewels, with attention, with the security of his name. Yet their union was not without strain. He was accustomed to control, to indulgence, to a freedom that often collided with the dignity Jackie required. Their worlds, though joined in marriage, remained partly apart. She was still the eternal First Lady, still the figure of grace, while he remained the restless magnate, bound to his empire of ships and deals. Still, their lives together created images the world could not ignore. Jackie reclining on a deck chair beneath Mediterranean sun, her dark glasses hiding her eyes, her silhouette serene against the expanse of sea. Jackie descending the marble steps of villas in Greece, her children at her side, her presence dignified amid gossip. Jackie moving through salons and banquets, admired but also whispered about, her mystery deepened rather than diminished. To some, she seemed diminished by this marriage, tarnished by association with a man deemed less refined than her legend. To others, she appeared more human, more pragmatic, a woman who sought what she needed rather than what the world demanded. It is easy to forget that Jackie's marriage to Onassis was also an act of defiance. She had been expected to remain the eternal widow, embalmed in sorrow, forever in black. She refused. She claimed a life beyond grief, even if it scandalized those who worshipped her image. In choosing Onassis, she asserted her will, reminding the world that she was not merely a symbol, but a living woman, capable of making choices that might not fit the myth others had written for her. In this sense, the marriage was both refuge and rebellion. Yet refuge is never absolute. The tragedies that haunted her did not disappear. Onassis himself faced heartbreak when his beloved son, Alexander, died in a plane crash in 1973. The loss devastated him, unraveling his vitality, leaving him hollowed by grief. Jackie, who had known such loss herself, must have felt the echo of her own sorrows in his. Their bond, strained at times, was tempered by shared mourning. But the shadows grew darker still, for Onassis's health declined rapidly after his son's death, and within 2 years he too was gone, leaving Jackie once more a widow. The wealth, the power, the exile, none of it had shielded her from the cruelty of fate. Looking back, one can see the irony, the paradox. She had married a man for protection, yet death came anyway, as it always had in her life, as it always seemed to follow her. Perhaps she wondered then if safety was an illusion, if fate could never truly be evaded. But perhaps, too, she recognized that in choosing Onassis, she had at least given her children years of shelter, a measure of distance from the dangers of American politics, the relentlessness of American media. For that, perhaps, she considered the choice worthwhile, despite the criticism, despite the scandal. The clink of glasses on the yacht, once a symbol of escape, now fades into the hollow echo of footsteps across marble floors, empty in grief. Jackie Kennedy Onassis was once again alone, widowed twice. Her life a tapestry woven with glamour and sorrow, resilience and fragility. She had walked through fire and emerged with dignity intact, though her soul carried wounds invisible to the eye. The marble halls quiet, the yacht stilled, the whispers of scandal softened into history. Yet the echo remains, leading us onward to the silence of another loss, the extinguishing of another flame, the grief that would return once more to claim her companion, leaving Jackie yet again to walk with absence. The clink of glasses on the yacht softens now into the echo of footsteps upon marble floors, hollow and resonant, as if each step carried with it both privilege and unease. Life with Aristotle Onassis, though wrapped in luxury, was never free of shadows. Jackie Kennedy Onassis moved through villas with ceilings painted in gold, through rooms lined with mirrors and chandeliers, yet in those spaces her own reflection often looked back at her as a stranger. The world saw opulence, but she felt exile. She was removed from the American stage that had once made her its eternal first lady, placed now upon islands and yachts where the Mediterranean sun concealed but did not dissolve the loneliness she carried. Onassis adored her in his way, lavishing gifts of extraordinary value, jewels glittering like frozen stars, gowns of silk and pearls, treasures that might have dazzled another woman. But Jackie, who had once restored the White House with antique chairs and historic paintings, knew that beauty alone was not substance. She accepted the gifts with grace, but their weight was heavier than it appeared, for each gem seemed to her another link in the chain of a life she had not wholly chosen. Her dignity remained, her poise undisturbed, but her eyes, behind the dark glasses that became her shield, often looked past the glitter toward horizons unseen. The world, hungry for spectacle, followed her relentlessly. Photographers lurked at beaches, in harbors, behind fences, snapping images of Jackie walking the decks of yachts, Jackie in sandals upon white stone paths, Jackie reclining beneath umbrellas while the sea stretched behind her. These photographs sold endlessly, plastered upon magazines consumed by a public fascinated by her allure. She became both prisoner and queen of this attention, unable to escape it, yet able to transform it into myth. The more they watched, the less she revealed. Her silence grew deeper, her mystery thicker. The woman they thought they knew became more elusive the more they sought her. Life with Onassis was not only glamour but also friction. He was a man used to command, a magnate whose empire of ships had been built upon his own will, his appetite for control. Jackie, though elegant and reserved, was not pliant. She had lived too long shaping her own image, protecting her children, guarding her soul, to bend easily to another's will. Their quarrels were whispered about, their distance noted, yet they remained bound together by the necessity of what they each offered. He gave her protection, she gave him prestige. It was a bargain as much as a bond, and perhaps both knew it, even as they attempted to live within its terms. For Jackie, exile had its advantages. Away from Washington, away from the American press, she gave her children a measure of freedom. Caroline and John Jr. could walk beaches, sail boats, explore gardens without the constant presence of flashbulbs. She guarded them fiercely, building a cocoon in which they could grow, even as she endured the cost of her own confinement. The marble halls echoed not only with her footsteps, but with the laughter of her children, and that laughter was her salvation. As always, they were her anchor, the reason she bore what otherwise might have felt unbearable. Yet exile also bred loneliness. In the great houses of Greece, amid the wealth of a man who seemed to own half the world, Jackie often retreated inward. She read constantly, returning to books as companions more faithful than jewels, more sustaining than banquets. She wrote letters. She reflected. She withdrew into the sanctuary of her own thoughts. Those who glimpsed her in quiet moments saw not a woman reveling in luxury, but one contemplative, guarded, perhaps even melancholy. She had lived too much tragedy to surrender to the pleasures of wealth without reservation. Her soul was marked by loss, and no marble floor or diamond necklace could erase that. And then, as if to remind her that sorrow cannot be outpaced by wealth or exile, tragedy struck Onassis himself. His beloved son, Alexander, died in a plane crash in 1973, the kind of sudden, violent loss that Jackie knew all too well. Onassis was devastated, undone by grief. The man who had built empires with his will now faltered, his vitality broken. Jackie stood beside him through this sorrow, a witness to yet another loss, carrying once more the weight of grief that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She had known such devastation in Dallas, and now she watched it consume her husband. Their bond, strained by differences, was tempered by shared mourning, for loss is the one companion that erases distance. But grief has a way of unraveling even the strongest, and Onassis's health declined rapidly after his son's death. Within 2 years, he too was gone, leaving Jackie once more a widow, left again with absence where once there had been presence. The marble floors echoed more hollowly, the yachts fell quiet, the banquets ceased. She had sought protection in his power, safety in his wealth, yet fate had claimed him as it had claimed so many others she loved. Jackie, still young, had now been twice widowed, her life bookended by tragedy once more. The world reacted with curiosity, with speculation, with gossip. Some pitied her, some criticized her, some wondered if she were cursed. But Jackie herself revealed little. She grieved in her way, in silence, her dignity unbroken, her children still her focus. The years with Onassis had not given her peace, but they had given her shelter for a time, a reprieve from the endless storms. And now that too was gone, leaving her again to find her place in a world that could never seem to let her simply live. The echo of her footsteps across marble floors lingers, fading slowly into silence. And from that silence arises another, more intimate sound, the extinguishing of a candle flame, the hush that follows when light is taken away, leaving only the memory of its glow. Onassis was gone, and Jackie was once more alone with her children, once more walking into the uncertainty of widowhood, once more carrying her sorrow as quietly as ever. The marble halls empty, the yachts moored, the laughter faded into memory. Yet within her, a resolve remained. She would go on. She would shape her life anew. She would find meaning beyond widowhood, beyond exile, beyond luxury. And so, into the darkness of the extinguished flame, we move forward with her, into the next chapter where words and books would become her companions, where she would carve out a place for herself not as ornament of others' lives, but as architect of memory. The echo of marble halls falls into darkness, and in that darkness a flame flickers once, trembles, and goes out. Aristotle Onassis, whose empire once seemed untouchable, was gone, leaving Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis widowed for the second time. The extinguishing of that candle was not only the end of a marriage, but the end of a chapter in which she had sought refuge, however imperfect, from the relentless gaze of history. She had married him for protection, for the hope that wealth and power might shield her children from tragedy. And yet death had come anyway, as it always had, a shadow that lingered near her life with unnerving persistence. Once again she found herself surrounded by silence, the absence of a husband, the stillness that follows the collapse of another world she had been asked to inhabit. The newspapers circled like birds of prey. They speculated on the inheritance, on the fortune that passed to her and to Onassis's surviving family, on the tensions that flared between Jackie and his daughter Christina, who never fully accepted her stepmother. To the world, these were stories of wealth and intrigue, but to Jackie, they were yet another burden, another intrusion upon grief that was already heavy. She bore it as she always had, with poise, with silence, with a refusal to be drawn into spectacle. She had long ago understood that to reveal too much was to surrender power, and so she remained enigmatic, letting others speculate while she retreated into her own interior world. This second widowhood was different from the first. With John Kennedy, her grief had been public, consumed by nations, sanctified by ritual. With Onassis, it was quieter, almost private, though it too was reported in headlines. She had not loved him as she had loved Jack, but she had shared with him years of companionship, of travel, of laughter and quarrels, of shelter for her children. His death was not only another loss, but also the closing of an experiment in survival. Once again, Jackie stood alone, no longer a wife, but something she had always been beneath the veils and jewels, a woman navigating fate on her own terms. In those years after Onassis, Jackie began to shift the course of her life. She no longer wished to be defined solely by the men she had married, by the tragedies that had befallen her. She turned instead to work, to books, to the world of publishing where she could carve out a new identity. At Viking Press, and later at Doubleday, she became an editor, a role that suited her perfectly. Surrounded by manuscripts and authors, she found herself not as ornament, but as architect, shaping words, guiding stories, bringing ideas into the world. For a woman who had always loved literature, who had filled her youth with books and notebooks, this was not simply employment, but fulfillment. She had returned to her first love, the written word, and in it she found renewal. Her colleagues in publishing often remarked upon her seriousness, her dedication. She worked not for show, but for substance, reading carefully, suggesting revisions, nurturing authors. She found joy in elevating voices, in giving form to stories that mattered. Some were surprised by her diligence, expecting the First Lady to be detached or ornamental. But Jackie confounded those expectations. She immersed herself fully, proving that she was not only a symbol, but also a worker, a thinker, a lover of words. In this role, she reclaimed a part of herself that had long been overshadowed by image. Her life as an editor also offered her a measure of anonymity. In the world of publishing, she was respected for her contributions rather than chased for her appearance. She walked to her office in New York, blended into the rhythms of the city, moved among colleagues who valued her presence, not as a relic of history, but as a partner in creation. For the first time in decades, she had something resembling ordinary life, and perhaps it was in those years that she felt most at peace. Yet peace for Jackie was never absolute. The shadow of tragedy never released its grip. She had buried 2 husbands, lost children in infancy, endured the assassinations of her husband and his brother, and carried within her the silence of those losses. They did not disappear simply because she worked with books or found comfort in the anonymity of the city. They lived within her like quiet ghosts, companions she could never dismiss. But perhaps, by surrounding herself with words, with memory shaped into narrative, she found a way to give meaning to her own history. Editing was not only labor, but also healing, a way of turning chaos into coherence, loss into story, silence into voice. Friends noticed that in these years Jackie seemed lighter, freer. She walked in Central Park, attended the ballet, surrounded herself with beauty not as ornament, but as nourishment. She still guarded her children fiercely, still deflected the press with the shield of her dark glasses and her reserve, but she also allowed herself small joys. She laughed more easily, spoke more openly with those she trusted, found companionship without the burdens of politics or scandal. She had learned that life would never be free of sorrow, but it could still be lived with grace. Her children grew, and in their growth, she saw her greatest accomplishment. Caroline matured into a thoughtful, intelligent woman, John Jr. into a charismatic young man who carried the charm of his father. They were her legacy, the living continuation of all that had been taken from her. She poured her love into them, her guidance, her protection. They were the reason she endured, the reason she sought stability, the reason she chose to live not as a relic of tragedy, but as a woman determined to nurture life where death had so often intruded. The candle flame that had extinguished with Onassis still lingered in her memory, but around her now were new lights, quieter, steadier, less dramatic, but more sustaining. The glow of lamps in her apartment as she worked late into the night, the gleam of streetlights on New York's avenues, the soft radiance of ballet stages, the flicker of laughter in her children's eyes. These lights were not eternal flames for the world to see, but intimate illuminations for her own survival. And yet, as we linger here, with Jackie seated at her desk, reading a manuscript pen in hand, we must not forget that loss would find her again, even if she would not live to witness it. The path ahead held both light and shadow, both fulfillment and sorrow. For John Jr., her beloved son, would one day vanish into the sea, taken as suddenly as his father had been, leaving Caroline as the sole continuation of the family she had fought so fiercely to preserve. Jackie, mercifully, would not live to endure that final blow. But for now, in these years after Onassis, she walked with a new steadiness, a woman who had endured and who had chosen, at last, to shape her own story. The extinguishing of the candle is behind us, but from its smoke rises the faint scratch of a pen against paper, the sound of words being shaped, of stories being guided, of memory turned into narrative. It is here that Jackie begins the next chapter of her life, no longer only widow or icon, but editor, mother, guardian of legacies, and at last, her own person. The smoke of the extinguished candle drifts upward and becomes, almost imperceptibly, the faint scratch of a pen against paper, a quieter sound than drums or bells, yet one that carries its own weight across time. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, twice widowed, twice transformed by tragedy, now turned toward the world of books and words, a world that had been her refuge since girlhood. In the halls of publishing, among manuscripts piled upon desks, she sought not merely distraction, but a new identity. No longer only the widow in black, no longer only the companion upon a yacht, she now became an editor, a woman who shapes stories rather than being endlessly shaped by them. Her choice to enter publishing was not ornamental, as some first imagined, but serious, deliberate, an act of reclaiming. At Viking Press, and later at Doubleday, she took her seat not as celebrity but as colleague, working side by side with editors and authors who at first could not help but be struck by the figure before them. The woman once seen beneath veils at Arlington, once glimpsed in sunglasses upon Mediterranean decks. Yet Jackie did not linger upon her past, nor did she permit others to do so in her presence. She asked to be judged not by her legend, but by her labor, and so she worked with diligence, her eyes scanning lines with precision, her suggestions clear, her dedication unwavering. For Jackie, books were more than words bound between covers. They were vessels of memory, monuments less fragile than marble, flames less fleeting than candles. In shaping them, she was shaping permanence. She had lived too long in the realm of images, of photographs consumed by the public, their meanings twisted and reinterpreted. Books, however, allowed her to preserve stories with intention, to create something lasting. She threw herself into this work with the same devotion she once gave to restoring the White House, with the same reverence she once brought to crafting Camelot as a memory for her husband. She was, at last, free to shape history, not as a participant on stage, but as a steward behind the curtain. Her colleagues were surprised by the seriousness she carried into her work. She arrived at the office, manuscripts tucked beneath her arm, her posture erect, her attire elegant, yet unassuming. She was never late, never careless, never anything but professional. Some authors, nervous at first, discovered in her an attentive listener, a guide who cared not about her own glory but about their words. She edited works of history, of culture, of art, subjects that had always nourished her. Each project bore the mark of her taste, her insistence upon dignity and refinement. In this role, Jackie found something she had long sought, a life defined not by others' gaze, but by her own choices. And yet, even in this quieter existence, the shadows of her past followed her. She could not walk the streets of New York without being recognized. Photographers still lingered, though less frenzied now, capturing her crossing avenues, entering theaters, walking in Central Park. Her dark glasses remained her shield, her reserve her armor. But the difference was this. In the city's rhythm, she found a measure of anonymity, a freedom in blending into crowds, a comfort in being one among many. The grandeur of Washington, the luxury of Greece, these had set her apart. New York, however, allowed her to belong, to live in the hum of ordinary life. In evenings, she attended the ballet, the opera, art exhibitions. These were not merely diversions, but sustenance, continuations of her lifelong devotion to beauty and culture. Surrounded by music and movement, she found echoes of the grace she had carried through her own trials. The stage reminded her that life, too, was performance, but one enriched by art rather than consumed by tragedy. Friends observed that she seemed lighter in these years, freer to laugh, freer to savor small joys. She had endured more than most, and yet she had not turned bitter. Instead, she carried herself with the serenity of one who had accepted that sorrow would always be present, but need not be all. Her children grew during these years, and they were her greatest pride. Carolyn, thoughtful and serious, reflected her mother's intellect, while John Jr., charismatic and restless, carried the charm of his father. Jackie guided them gently, fiercely protective, yet allowing them space to discover themselves. She attended their school events, encouraged their studies, nurtured their independence. More than anything, she wished them to live freely, not as monuments to a family tragedy, but as individuals with their own destinies. It was for them that she had endured, for them that she had remarried, for them that she now sought stability and meaning in her work. They were, as she once confided, her greatest legacy. In her apartment on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by books, photographs, and mementos, Jackie found at last a sense of home. The view of the city stretched before her, alive and unending, a reminder that life continued. She read late into the night, editing manuscripts, writing letters, reflecting on the paths she had taken. Those who visited her spoke of a woman both warm and reserved, gracious yet private, generous in conversation, yet careful never to reveal more than she wished. The mystery remained, deepened even, for her silence was not only habit but also principle. She had learned that the unspoken often holds more power than the spoken, and so, in these years, she lived less as a symbol and more as a soul. She shaped books, guided her children, attended the arts, walked the streets. She had discovered a quieter rhythm, one less dramatic but more nourishing. Yet even in this calm, the memory of her losses lingered, like shadows cast upon walls that never entirely fade. She had learned to live with them, to let them coexist with joy, to weave them into the fabric of her being without allowing them to dominate. This was her triumph, her final transformation, to take sorrow and turn it into dignity, to take silence and turn it into strength, to take exile and turn it into belonging. The scratch of the pen continues, steady, deliberate, shaping words into permanence, and as it does, we sense the laughter of children in the distance, faint but clear, reminding us that Jackie's story was never hers alone. It was bound to the lives of Caroline and John Jr., bound to the future that stretched ahead of them. Their laughter, bright against the backdrop of her solemnity, carries us forward now into the next chapter where joy and sorrow once again entwine, where the fragile continuation of her family would both uplift her and haunt her, as memory and fate played their unrelenting roles. The scratch of the pen fades, and in its place rises the sound of children's laughter, faint yet bright, echoing down hallways, threading through gardens, weaving itself into the quiet heart of Jacqueline Kennedy, Onassis's later years. For all the roles she had been forced to bear, First Lady, widow, wife of a magnate, figure of myth, her truest role, the one she cherished above all, was that of mother. Caroline and John Jr. were the living proof of her endurance, the continuation of a life she had fought to preserve through storms and shadows. Their laughter was music, fragile yet resilient, a reminder that love could still bloom even after so much loss. She had raised them with a fierce devotion, always guarding their privacy, always resisting the world's attempts to consume them as it had consumed her. From the earliest days after Dallas, she had made them her anchor, drawing strength from their presence, shaping her choices around their safety. Now, as they grew, she watched them with pride and with tenderness, marveling at how they carried pieces of their father within them, yet also revealed themselves as wholly unique. Caroline, thoughtful and steady, carried her mother's reserve and intelligence. She moved with grace, spoke with care, pursued knowledge with quiet determination. John Jr., by contrast, was lively, charming, restless, the image of his father in his smile and his stride. The world adored him, as it once adored his father, and Jackie both rejoiced in and feared the light that followed him. Her devotion to them was shadowed always by the memory of those she had lost. Arabella, stillborn before she had even taken her first breath. Patrick, born too soon, surviving only 2 days before slipping away. These children, unseen by the world, were never absent from Jackie's heart. In her mind, they lingered as shadows beside Caroline and John, companions invisible yet always felt. Perhaps she imagined them growing alongside their siblings, walking in gardens, laughing on beaches, filling the spaces of the home with voices that would never come. The presence of absence is a peculiar kind of grief, less visible than sudden tragedy, yet woven into every joy with quiet insistence. Jackie carried it always, and it deepened her love for the children who had survived. She held Caroline and John Jr. closer because she knew too well how fragile life could be, how easily it could slip away. She nurtured them not only with affection, but with lessons. She taught them to value culture, to cherish books, to walk with dignity, to protect their own privacy. She encouraged them to cultivate independence, to think for themselves, to build lives not entirely defined by their family's name. Yet she also knew that the Kennedy legacy was a mantle they could never fully set aside. The world expected much from them, projected upon them the myths of their father, the dream of Camelot reborn. Jackie understood the weight of such expectations, and she did what she could to shield her children from them. But she also prepared them, gently, for the reality that their lives would always be lived in shadow and in light. Their home in New York became a sanctuary, filled with books and music, with art upon the walls, with the quiet hum of ordinary life. Jackie sought to give her children what had so often been denied to her: stability, continuity, a rhythm not constantly interrupted by tragedy or spectacle, and yet even in this she could not entirely escape the world's gaze. Photographers lingered outside, capturing images of John Jr. as he grew into a young man, Caroline as she stepped into her own maturity. Their lives were not entirely their own, but Jackie's presence made the intrusion bearable. She was their shield, their guide, their constant. In later years, as they entered adulthood, Jackie watched with pride as Caroline pursued her studies, her work, her family life. She saw in her daughter the continuation of her own quiet strength, the same love of learning, the same dignity in public presence. And in John Jr., she saw the vitality and charisma that had once captivated her in his father. He became a lawyer, then a publisher, his charm opening doors, his restlessness driving him toward new ventures. To Jackie, he was still her beloved son, playful and endearing, though the world could not help but see him as a living echo of John Kennedy. She both rejoiced in his promise and feared the dangers that seemed always to accompany the Kennedys. The laughter of her children, though a source of joy, was never free of shadow. Jackie knew too well the fragility of life. Every plane flight, every public appearance, every risk taken by her son must have carried with it the tremor of dread. She had lived through too many sudden losses to believe in the permanence of safety, and so she cherished each moment, each smile, each shared meal, each walk through the city. For her, joy was never simple. It was always entwined with the awareness of its impermanence. Perhaps that awareness deepened her love, made it more intense, more deliberate. She did not take her children's presence for granted, for she knew how easily it could be taken away. The sound of their laughter lingers, bright yet fragile, echoing through her apartment, across years that seemed at last to offer her peace. But even as it lingered, another sound began to rise beneath it, the low, distant roar of an airplane engine. It is faint at first, barely audible, but it grows steadily, reminding us that fate, never content to let her rest, would one day claim her son as it had claimed his father, leaving Caroline alone to carry the family forward. Jackie would be spared that sorrow, passing from this world before John Jr.'s plane fell into the sea. Yet in the laughter of her children, in the shadows of those she had lost, one hears the foreshadowing of that final tragedy. For now, however, we remain with her in these years of relative calm, hearing the laughter of Caroline and John Jr. against the backdrop of memory, feeling her devotion as a mother, sensing the shadows of Arabella and Patrick lingering unseen. The echo of laughter continues, but within it is the whisper of fragility, the reminder that joy and sorrow are never far apart. And so the sound carries us forward, blending slowly into the deepening roar of engines, the harbinger of skies that would one day turn from freedom to loss. The laughter of children drifts away, and in its place rises the steady roar of an airplane engine, deep and unrelenting, vibrating through the air as if fate itself were preparing another blow. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis did not live to hear that roar turn into silence, did not witness the tragedy that would claim her son, John Jr., in the summer of 1999. By then she had already left the world, spared the final sorrow that might have broken even her formidable composure. Yet when we listen now to that engine's sound, when we remember its descent into the ocean's dark, we cannot help but imagine what she might have felt had she been alive, how she would have endured, and whether endurance would have been possible at all. John Jr. had grown into the image of his father, carrying the same charisma, the same easy charm, the same way of moving through a room that drew eyes without effort. The world adored him, calling him America's Prince, a figure onto whom they projected the dream of Camelot renewed. He became a lawyer, then a publisher, creating George Magazine, a blend of politics and culture that reflected his curiosity and wit. He dated models and actresses, was photographed endlessly, lived under the same glare of attention that had once consumed his mother. Jackie, while alive, had shielded him as much as she could, warning him of the dangers, urging him toward responsibility, reminding him always of the fragility of life. Yet he was young, and youth does not listen easily to caution. That July night, he piloted his small plane into darkness, carrying with him his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren. Somewhere over the Atlantic, near Martha's Vineyard, the plane vanished into the sea. The roar of the engine ended, replaced by silence, then by the frantic search of rescuers. The wreckage was found days later, their bodies claimed by the water. For the nation, it was another chapter in the long and haunted saga of the Kennedys, another bright life extinguished too soon. For Caroline, left now the sole surviving child of Jackie and John, it was a loss almost unbearable, the closing of a circle that had begun with the gunshots in Dallas. But Jackie was gone by then. Her own life ended in 1994, and so she did not have to live through this sorrow. In that, perhaps, there was mercy, for she had endured enough. 2 husbands buried, 2 children lost in infancy, 2 assassinations within one family, years of relentless scrutiny, years of grief worn behind veils. To add to that, the loss of her son, the boy whose salute had broken the world's heart on the day of his father's funeral, might have been too much even for her. Fate, cruel though it had been, spared her that final blow. One cannot help but wonder, did some unseen hand of destiny grant her this mercy, allowing her to leave the world before it could inflict its last wound? Or was it merely coincidence, the indifferent unfolding of time? The roar of the engine carries us back to the images of John Jr. as a child, his small hand raised in salute, his eyes innocent, his presence already emblematic. Jackie had devoted her life to protecting him and Carolyn, to shielding them from the curse she feared, to giving them stability and privacy. She had succeeded in many ways, guiding them into adulthood with strength and love. Yet in the end, she could not shield him from the sky, from the sea, from the fate that seemed to stalk her family like an unrelenting shadow. The tragedy of John Jr.'s death was not hers to witness, but it remains tied to her story. for it reveals the relentless pattern of loss that defined her life and her legacy. For those who remembered Jackie, news of his death brought her memory back with full force. They imagined her watching from beyond, imagined her sorrow, imagined her arms reaching for him once more. Some found comfort in the belief that mother and son were reunited, that she was waiting for him, that in death, the separations of life are healed. Others found only cruelty in the repetition of loss, the sense that no amount of grace or dignity could ever protect the Kennedys from tragedy. And yet, in remembering Jackie, one recalls that she had always faced loss not with despair, but with silence, with composure, with an unyielding dignity. Perhaps she would have faced this too in the same way, though the thought chills us to imagine it. Caroline, left alone, became the bearer of the family's continuity. She inherited her mother's reserve, her sense of duty, her devotion to privacy. Through her, Jackie's legacy endured, not only the legacy of glamour and tragedy, but also of resilience, of choosing to live despite the weight of history. In Caroline, one sees the quiet strength that Jackie had cultivated, the same ability to endure without spectacle, the same refusal to be consumed by the world's gaze. It is a reminder that Jackie's true gift was not style, not mystery, not even legend, but the strength she instilled in her children to walk through fire with dignity. The roar of the engine fades into silence, leaving us to reflect upon the strange mercy of Jackie's absence from that final sorrow. She had suffered enough, and perhaps fate, which had so often been merciless, offered her at last a reprieve. She did not live to see the sea claim her son. She did not live to hear the engines falter. She did not live to feel the final fracture of her heart. Instead, she left before, spared in a way that allows us to wonder whether even tragedy has its limits, whether even grief must one day rest. The silence that follows is not empty. It is filled with prayers, with memories, with the quiet murmur of church voices that had once prayed for her in her own final illness. The hush of prayer becomes the next sound, the gentle cadence of litany as Jackie herself enters her last chapter, facing her own mortality with the same calm she had carried through life. The roar of the airplane has passed, and in its place comes the hush of illness, the slow descent into night, the acceptance of an ending she could no longer delay. The roar of the airplane engine fades into silence, and from that silence arises the hush of illness, the quiet murmur of prayers spoken in dimly lit rooms, the cadence of voices that know the end is near. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who had walked through fire, who had carried veils of sorrow and shields of dignity, entered at last into the final chapter of her life. It was the early 1990s and the years of raising her children, of working among books, of carving out a quieter rhythm in New York had given her something resembling peace. But even peace cannot hold back the frailty of the body. She was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a disease that crept upon her slowly, then swiftly, until the physicians could no longer promise reprieve. For a woman who had seen so much death, the approach of her own seemed not frightening, but familiar, like the arrival of a guest long expected. Those around her remarked upon her calm. She did not rage, she did not despair. She accepted the knowledge of her illness with the same composure that had marked her through every trial. Friends said she wished only to go home, to spend her last days in her apartment overlooking Central Park, surrounded by her books, her art, her children. She did not want to die in sterile rooms beneath the hum of hospital lights, but in the comfort of her own space, with the familiar sounds of the city drifting through windows, with the laughter of her grandchildren near, with the warmth of family gathered close. Her acceptance was not resignation, but clarity. She had always understood that life was fragile, that no one is promised length or security. She had lived enough tragedy to know that death was simply part of the human weave. And so she prepared. She set her affairs in order, spoke quietly with Caroline and John Jr., shared moments of tenderness, gave instructions, expressed her love. She was, as ever, careful, deliberate, thoughtful in how she shaped her final days. There was no spectacle, no attempt to summon attention, only the wish for privacy, for dignity, for the chance to leave the world as she had often lived within it, guarded, poised, resolute. She welcomed friends into her home, received their words, but did not linger on sentiment. Her gaze, always direct, now seemed to look beyond, as if she were already partly elsewhere, already hearing the voices that call the dying gently away. The city outside continued its restless movement. Taxis honking, children shouting in the park, music rising from open windows. Within her apartment, the rhythm was slower, quieter, the hush of prayer mingling with the turning of pages as she continued to read until her strength no longer allowed it. Books, her lifelong refuge, remained companions to the end, their words a bridge between this world and the next. She read poetry, history, reflections that mirrored her own contemplative nature. Perhaps in those words she found confirmation of what she had long believed, that lives are not measured in years alone, but in the meaning carried, the dignity preserved, the memory left behind. As illness advanced, her body weakened, but her mind remained clear. She faced each day with serenity, each night with peace. Those who visited her often left with the impression not of a woman in decline, but of a soul already transcending. She had lived as symbol and myth, but she wished to die simply, without fanfare, surrounded not by cameras, but by family. And so it was. On May 19, 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis passed from this world at the age of 64, leaving behind not only her children, but an entire nation that had followed her life with fascination, sorrow, and admiration. The prayers that filled her apartment in those last hours extended outward into churches, into homes, into hearts. People across the world lit candles, spoke softly of her, remembered the pink suit in Dallas, the veil at Arlington, the smile in Paris, the dark glasses in New York. They remembered her as the eternal First Lady, the woman who had given form to grief, who had carried elegance like armor, who had transformed silence into strength. Yet in her death, many also glimpsed the humanity that had often been hidden, the woman who loved books, who cherished her children, who longed for ordinary joys, even amid extraordinary sorrows. Her funeral was held at Arlington, beside John Kennedy, beside the eternal flame she herself had lit 3 decades before. The ceremony was solemn, dignified, fitting for the woman who had embodied dignity through all her trials. Leaders came once more, just as they had in 1963, walking behind her casket, their faces grave, their gestures respectful. Caroline and John Jr. walked with composure, carrying themselves as their mother had taught them, their grief tempered by the poise she had instilled. The eternal flame flickered nearby, its light unchanged, its endurance a testament to the memory she had shaped. In death, as in life, Jackie was bound to that flame, to the myth of Camelot, to the sorrow and beauty of an era that would never fully fade. And yet, beyond the rituals, there was something simpler, something more intimate. The memory of a woman who had endured more than most, who had raised her children with love, who had sought meaning in art and history, who had found solace in the rhythm of words. To remember Jackie is to remember both the icon and the person, both the eternal First Lady and the private soul who walked through Central Park, who edited manuscripts by lamplight, who laughed with her children, who bore sorrow with silence. She was, in her final years, less a monument than a mother, less a symbol than a seeker of peace. The hush of prayers fades now into the slow closing of a heavy door, the sound that follows when one life ends and another enters memory. For Jackie, the door closed with dignity, with calm, with love gathered near. But memory does not end with the door. It lingers, it persists, it deepens, becoming myth and question, fascination and reflection. And as the door closes, we hear once more the footsteps of time, carrying us onward into speculation, into the questions that remain, into the legacy that continues to stir imagination long after the body has rested. The heavy door closes with a slow, resonant sound, and behind it lies the stillness of death. Yet before it spreads the vast space of memory where Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis lingers, neither wholly gone nor entirely present. The hush of prayers recedes, and what remains is reflection, the long gaze backward across her life, the weaving together of all its threads into a tapestry of beauty, sorrow, endurance, and enigma. For Jackie, as the world always called her, did not leave the stage when her body was laid to rest. She became instead more elusive, more enduring, her image frozen and multiplied, refracted through memory, through books, through photographs, through endless retellings. She became, as she had long seemed destined to be, an icon whose meaning cannot be fixed, an eternal question clothed in elegance. Her legacy rests not only in what she did, but in how she carried herself through what was done to her. She did not write manifestos, did not proclaim doctrines, did not shape policy or command armies. Her influence was subtler, quieter, yet in some ways no less profound. She embodied grace in tragedy, dignity in chaos, silence in the face of the world's insistent gaze. She taught, without words, that strength need not be loud, that endurance can be a kind of defiance, that mystery itself can be a form of power. Through her, people learned to see that elegance was not superficial, but could be a vessel for resilience, that beauty could coexist with grief, that composure could be an act of survival. And yet, what did she conceal? This question lingers like a shadow across her legacy. For all that the world saw of Jackie, the pink suit, the black veil, the dark glasses, what remained hidden was always greater. Did she love John Kennedy with a passion that survived his betrayals? Or did she endure him out of duty, out of ambition, out of calculation? Did she marry Onassis for protection alone? Or was there a tenderness between them the world never glimpsed? Did she carry bitterness in her silence? Or was her serenity genuine? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps they always will. Jackie herself ensured it. She revealed only fragments, controlled the image, shaped the narrative, and left behind ambiguity. It is this ambiguity that continues to fascinate, for mystery invites endless reflection. Her style, too, endures as legacy. The pillbox hats, the tailored suits, the pearls, the dark glasses. These were more than fashion. They were symbols. Women across continents imitated her, not simply to look like her, but to capture something of her aura, her self-possession, her refinement. Style, for Jackie, was never frivolous. It was language. It spoke when she chose not to speak. It shielded her when words would have been too vulnerable. It declared dignity when sorrow threatened to undo her. Even now, decades after her death, her image inspires. Photographs of her still circulate, not as relics of the past, but as living icons of poise. Few figures in history achieve such timelessness, and fewer still do so without ever courting it openly. But legacy is more than image. Jackie left behind the eternal flame at Arlington, a symbol that burns not only for her husband, but for an era, for the fragility of hope and the endurance of memory. She left behind books she edited, stories she nurtured, authors she guided into print. She left behind her children, Caroline and John Jr., who embodied her devotion, who carried forward both her sorrow and her strength. She left behind the sense that even in a world torn by violence and betrayal, one can move with grace, one can endure without surrendering dignity. Her life was not a manifesto, yet it became one, written in silence and gestures rather than words. And yet again, questions return. Was she content in her later years, or did sorrow remain her constant companion? Did she ever escape the sense of exile that haunted her, or did she simply learn to live within it? Did she find peace in books, in ballet, and art, or were these only consolations against the emptiness of loss? To speculate is to acknowledge that Jackie herself designed her legacy to resist resolution. She offered the world enough to admire, enough to inspire, enough to love, but not enough to fully know. She remained until the end a mystery, and perhaps that was her greatest triumph. For mystery endures where certainty fades. The closing of the heavy door becomes then not an ending, but a threshold. On one side lies the life she lived, rich in beauty, marked by tragedy, filled with contradictions. On the other side lies her place in memory, where she is not bound by chronology or fact, but exists as presence, as symbol, as eternal question. Some remember her as the grieving widow, others as the stylish first lady, others as the editor bent over manuscripts, others as the mother shielding her children. All are true, and yet none is complete. Jackie cannot be contained by a single image, a single story, a single role. She was and remains many things at once, light and shadow, public and private, strength and sorrow. As we linger upon her legacy, the closing door remains before us heavy and final, yet behind it we hear faint sounds still, the rustle of papers, the laughter of children, the click of cameras, the tolling of bells, the roar of an engine, the hush of prayer. All the sounds of her life echo faintly, blending into one another, unresolved. They remind us that legacy is not a single note, but a chord, complex and layered, resonant with contradiction. Jackie's chord continues to play long after her departure, haunting the ears of history, calling us to wonder, to reflect, to ask again the questions that will never be answered. The heavy door is shut, yet in its silence we hear the faint ticking of a clock, steady and inevitable, reminding us that time itself is the keeper of all legacies, that even the most radiant figures are subject to its passage. But some, like Jackie, escape time's erosion. They remain timeless not because they defied mortality, but because they carried themselves in a way that made mortality itself seem noble. The ticking clock becomes then not an erasure, but an extension, a continuation of memory, carrying her forward into eternity. The ticking of the clock grows louder, steady, insistent, marking the passage of time even as memory resists its erosion. Each beat is a reminder that years advance, that new generations rise, yet within those beats there is also the stubborn presence of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who lingers in imagination as vividly as she ever did in life. The heavy door, once closed, now opens again, not into her presence, but into speculation, into the realm of myth and interpretation. For Jackie's story did not end with her burial at Arlington, nor even with the extinguishing of her body's breath. It continues in books written, in whispers exchanged, in theories debated, in films produced, in photographs endlessly reprinted. She is no longer merely a woman of flesh and sorrow, but a figure shaped anew with each telling, her silence filling with words not her own. The myths that surround her are countless, and perhaps inevitable. For when someone reveals so little, the imagination rushes to fill the gaps. Was she deeply in love with John Kennedy, or was theirs a marriage of calculation and endurance? Did she marry Aristotle Onassis for protection, for companionship, or for reasons more intricate still? Did she find peace in her later years, Or did she remain haunted by grief? Each book, each biography, each article claims an answer, yet none can claim certainty. Jackie's life, carefully guarded by her own design, defies conclusion. She gave the world only fragments, and in those fragments people construct their own stories. Historians pore over letters, friends recount memories, journalists speculate about secrets, and yet the essence of Jackie remains elusive. Some portray her as a tragic heroine, forever cloaked in sorrow, bearing her suffering with saintly composure. Others describe her as pragmatic, calculating, shaping her choices with sharp awareness of power and protection. Still others see in her a romantic, a woman who loved deeply and endured heartbreak with quiet dignity. Perhaps she was all of these, at different times, in different measures. Human lives are not singular, and Jackie's was less so than most, stretched as it was between the private and the public, between the individual and the icon. The fascination endures not only because of who she was, but because of what she represents. She became the embodiment of the American dream: beauty, elegance, a marriage into power, yet also its shadow, for that dream was shattered by tragedy, again and again. She was the fairy tale princess whose story turned to sorrow, the embodiment of grace in an age of turmoil, the woman who seemed to carry both glamour and grief in equal measure. To reflect upon Jackie is to reflect upon the fragility of dreams themselves, upon the way history creates and destroys its symbols. Books about her continue to appear, each claiming to reveal what was hidden. Some explore her marriages, others her fashion, others her political influence, others her private relationships. Each contributes something, yet none can claim completeness. For how can one capture the essence of a woman who built her life upon the art of mystery? Jackie understood better than anyone that what is hidden often carries more power than what is revealed. She left the world enough to admire, but not enough to know, and in that space the fascination persists. Even now, photographs of her circulate with undiminished power. Jackie on a yacht, sunglasses shielding her gaze, Jackie in black, veil falling over her face as she walks beside a coffin, Jackie in the White House, poised and luminous, speaking softly about history, Jackie with her children, her hand resting gently on their shoulders. Each image is studied, interpreted, reinterpreted, not as simple record but as symbol. Her life has become a gallery in which each photograph is a painting, each painting a mirror reflecting not only her but those who look upon her. People see in Jackie what they long for: grace, strength, beauty, endurance, and in that longing she remains eternal. But the ticking clock reminds us that fascination itself is fragile. New generations rise who did not see Dallas, who did not hear the muffled drums of the funeral, who did not live through the years of Camelot. For them, Jackie is history, distant yet still shimmering. Will her image endure another century, or will it fade into the shadows of memory, known only to those who study books and photographs? The question lingers unanswered, and perhaps that too is part of her legacy, that she resists finality, that she remains suspended between presence and absence, remembered and forgotten, idol and enigma. Speculation itself becomes part of the myth. What did she think as she leaned over her husband in the motorcade, her suit stained with his blood? What did she feel as she lit the eternal flame at Arlington? What thoughts stirred in her as she walked the marble halls of Onassis's villas, as she edited manuscripts late at night, as she faced her own death with calm acceptance? We cannot know. We can only imagine, and in imagining, we continue her story. Jackie becomes less a person and more a mirror, reflecting our own questions about grief, dignity, endurance, and the human capacity to survive the unbearable. The door to speculation remains open, wide and unending, and through it flows the endless fascination of those who continue to write, to speak, to wonder about her. And yet, as we stand in that doorway, we hear still the ticking of the clock, slow, steady, inexorable. Each beat reminds us that time advances, that fascination may one day wane, that myths may one day fade. But for now, the clock carries her forward, carrying the memory of the eternal First Lady into yet another generation, another retelling, another moment of reflection. The ticking continues, softer now, slowing, as if preparing to pause. And in that slowing, we sense the stillness approaching, the stillness in which Jackie herself now resides, neither explaining nor defending, but simply enduring in memory. The clock's hands circle, but in that circle there is also silence, a silence into which we now move, where speculation yields to contemplation, and contemplation yields to stillness. The ticking of the clock slows, each beat longer than the last, as though time itself were hesitating, reluctant to move forward, reluctant to release the memory it carries. And then, in the deep hush that follows, stillness spreads like a soft veil across the room. It is here, in this stillness, that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis remains, not as a voice, not as a presence in the flesh, but as an image suspended in memory, preserved in photographs, whispered about in stories, contemplated in silences late at night. She has become eternal, not because her life was long, but because her life was luminous and tragic in ways that resist forgetting. To think of her now is to see her in fragments. One sees the young girl riding her horse across sunlit fields, her dark hair blown back by the wind, her eyes alight with mischief and promise. One sees the radiant bride standing beside John Kennedy as wedding bells tolled, her smile luminous beneath the weight of expectation. One sees the First Lady gliding through the White House halls, speaking softly of history, carrying elegance like a crown. One sees the widow in pink, blood upon her suit, leaning over her fallen husband as the world collapsed. One sees the veiled mourner at Arlington, lighting the eternal flame with steady hand, her children at her side. One sees the woman upon a yacht, dark glasses shielding her gaze from the relentless press, her figure both exposed and untouchable. One sees the editor at her desk, pen in hand, manuscripts spread before her, shaping words into permanence. One sees the mother, her arms around Caroline and John Jr., her love fierce and protective, her devotion unending. And finally, one sees her in her last days, serene in illness, accepting, ready to step into silence with dignity intact. These fragments woven together create not a single portrait but a mosaic, complex and enigmatic, shimmering with contradictions. Her image endures not because it is complete, but because it is incomplete. What she revealed was enough to inspire, but what she concealed ensures fascination. She was beautiful, but her beauty was deepened by sorrow. She was stylish, but her style was inseparable from her strength. She was dignified, but her dignity was shaped by tragedy. She was loved, but she was also lonely. She was admired, but she was never truly known. It is this paradox, this tension between light and shadow, that grants her permanence. Icons who are explained entirely fade. Icons who remain mysterious endure. Jackie belongs to the latter, her silence more powerful than words, her restraint more eloquent than confession. The stillness in which she now resides is not emptiness, but resonance. Her memory vibrates in photographs, in films, in the endless retellings of her story. When one looks upon her image, one does not simply see her. One feels the presence of history itself. She is the embodiment of an era, the vessel of a dream, the shadow of a tragedy, the echo of a song called Camelot that still lingers faintly in the air. Yet she is also something more intimate, the mother who held her children close, the woman who loved books, the soul who sought peace. To remember Jackie is to remember both history and humanity, both grandeur and fragility. And so she remains, eternal in the imagination, the eternal First Lady. Her life reminds us that history is not only written in battles and laws, but also in gestures and silences, in how one endures sorrow, in how one carries oneself when the world is watching. Jackie carried herself with grace, even when grace was the only shield she had. She taught, without saying, that dignity can survive even the deepest wounds, that silence can speak more loudly than words, that beauty can coexist with tragedy without being diminished. As the clock's ticking slows to stillness, we find ourselves not at an end but at a reflection. Jackie's story does not conclude. It echoes. It lingers in whispers, in questions that cannot be answered, in images that do not fade. She is there in the sound of church bells, in the flash of a camera, in the laughter of children, in the hush of the sea, in the flicker of a flame that never dies. She is both presence and absence, both memory and myth, both light and shadow. The stillness deepens, and in that stillness we see her, walking as she always did, with poise, with mystery, with silence that reveals and conceals at once. She is gone, yet she is here. She is past, yet she is eternal. And so we close, not with an answer, but with a silence, the kind she herself would have chosen, a silence that holds everything, her beauty, her sorrow, her strength, her mystery, a silence that endures, as she endures, forever, the eternal First Lady.